Hi everyone and welcome into Burner, as today the human has a new job as the housekeeper of Ludwig van Beethoven. So our mission today is to impress one of the greatest composers of all time. Along the way, we'll see what he was like as a boss, what his peers thought of him, but most important of all, what was Beethoven's favorite food. To achieve our mission, we have an ace up our sleeve. Historical hindsight. Weirdly, the Wi-Fi in the 19th century was pretty stable. Beethoven's contemporary and musician Ignaz von Seyfried wrote, among his favorite dishes was a kind of bread soup cooked like mush, to which he looked forward with pleasure every Thursday. It happens to be Thursday today, so better give the maestro what he expects. The recipe we are using is from a cookbook popular during Beethoven's time, Das Wienerische bewährtes Kochbuch by Ignaz Gartler, or in English, the tried and tested Viennese cookbook. According to this book, bread soup is made from finely chopped onion fried in lard, then fatty meat broth is poured over it along with parsley, chives, salt, pepper and thinly sliced black bread. The black bread has a very sour taste, which is compensated by poaching fresh egg yolks in the soup. However, you won't have to do that. You see, Beethoven was a bit peculiar about this. He demanded that his housekeepers provide him with 10 whole eggs, which he would then crack, sniff, and, provided they passed his smell test, add to the soup. Not so fast. You see, the position of Beethoven's housekeeper is something we today would call a high turnover position. He didn't eat all 10 eggs. The ones that did not pass the smell test were not simply discarded, they were repurposed as ammunition. In the words of Seyfried, he first separated and tested them by holding them against the light, then decapitated them with his own hand and anxiously sniffed them to see whether they were fresh. When fate decreed that some among them scented their straw, so to speak, the storm broke. In a voice of thunder, the housekeeper was cited to court. She held herself in readiness to beat a quick retreat before, as was customary, the cannonade was about to begin, and the decapitate batteries would begin to play upon her back and pour out their yellow-white sticky intestines over her in veritable lava streams. This is not a one-off anecdote or a piece of gossip told behind Beethoven's back. No, he himself wrote proudly about similar incidents in letters to friends. In one letter, he writes that he threw half a dozen books at his housekeeper as a New Year's gift, which he says caused her to be wonderfully changed for the better. On a different occasion, his housekeeper interrupted his lunch with a friend by bringing more food halfway through the meal. In response, he threw the steaming dish of noodles back at her. His aggression didn't stay contained to his housekeepers. He once also threw a bowl of stew at a waiter who brought him the wrong order in a Viennese tavern. Oh dear, I think the human was a bit fed up with the maestro's mannerisms. What is the poor man going to do now that you've left him to his own devices? Should he cook for himself? Sure, but you might want to read up on how that went. Seyfried again tells us that Beethoven set forth to cook for his friends. Apparently, that fateful night, Beethoven was wearing a blue apron as he welcomed his friends. After having them wait for over an hour and a half, Seyfried describes the meal as follows. The soup recalled those charitable leavings distributed to beggars in the taverns. The beef was but half done and calculated to gratify only an ostrich. The vegetables floated in a mixture of water and grease, and the roast seemed to have been smoked in the chimney. Beethoven himself apparently loved it, boasting about how good his food was, while his guests satiated themselves with some bread, the presented fruit, and above all, wine. According to Seyfried, shortly after this, the composer grew bored of cooking and sought to reinstate his housekeeper. So maybe just go back for the sake of his friends? Now, to make sure that all of this is water under the bridge, we're going to make something special. Something that will really impress our employer. We still need to inspire him to write the Ninth Symphony after all. Discovering what his favorite food was is no easy task, but here history throws us a blessing in disguise. It's well known that Beethoven struggled with deafness in his later years. This was a terrible fate for the composer, but it gives the contemporary historian, and us, a unique insight into his mind and everyday life. In an age before standardized sign language, Beethoven coped with his deafness by carrying notebooks with him wherever he went, and having his companions write their side of the conversation in them. His stray thoughts, observations, and interestingly for our purposes, grocery lists also make their way into these books. There's actually a bit of story surrounding these books, which we'll get to in a bit. So what did Beethoven like? There's Krammetsvögel, thrush fattened on juniper berries. We know it was one of his father's favorite dishes, and he mentioned it a few times too. However, this is only available in late autumn and hardly suitable for the table all year round. We also know that Beethoven liked veal. Now, aside from the ethical concerns that come with veal, we have to make sure that we don't bankrupt old Ludwig with this. Can he even afford veal? You might have heard that Beethoven was a well-off composer in his time, having been granted an annuity in 1809 of 4,000 florins a year by the Archduke and two princes. This was a rich sum, once you consider that a man of the lower middle classes could get by on 1,000 florins a year. However, Beethoven wasn't that lucky, as his patrons soon died or went bankrupt. In addition to that, the political turmoil of 19th century Austria caused the funds that he did get to quickly diminish in value. To Beethoven, money was a constant worry, and he supported himself through a combination of performing, teaching and composing, which made his deafness all the more devastating, as it meant he could no longer perform or teach, leaving composition his sole source of income. On that note, there's something we want to talk to you about before we continue with this search for Beethoven's favorite food. Odds are that you've been served up an advert or even pay for YouTube. At this moment, we don't get any of that money, but you can help us and you don't have to pay anything. You see, we have to reach a certain amount of watch hours, and once we reach those, YouTube will start giving us a slice of the cake. You're currently watching, so you are already helping. Thank you. But if you want, you can help out even more by hitting the subscribe button, if you are not already a subscriber, and the like button. This will help spread our video to more people and will help us get the famed 4,000 hour goal. Now, back to the story. Where were we? Oh yes, finding Beethoven's favorite food. According to Anton Schindler, Beethoven's assistant in the latter years of his life, one of his favorite dishes was macaroni and cheese. Hold on, we're not done yet. This account came from Schindler, which means this requires some further scrutiny. Let's talk about Schindler for a bit. Anton Felix Schindler played a key role in preserving Beethoven's conversation books and was one of Beethoven's earliest biographers. After Beethoven passed away, it was Schindler who sold nearly 140 of Beethoven's conversation books to the Prussian Royal Library. First-degree sources like this are a rarity, so when the sale was done, there was much rejoicing among historians. Turns out, this was only the start of an arduous journey for Beethoven's conversation books. Shortly after arriving in Berlin, the books went through 2 world wars and a high-profile theft before ending up isolated in East Berlin. However, all these challenges would pale in comparison to the biggest obstacle of them all, Beethoven's handwriting. It took a dedicated team of academics many years of work and presumably a lot of squinting before Ludwig's notes were transcribed in full, and we can see why. One thing he did write legibly were the numbers, and with a high-quality source like this, even small tidbits give valuable insight. Like how, for all his musical genius, he never quite mastered multiplication, though he was a big fan of addition. His alphabetic writing, though, was less transparent. We honestly think it was harder to crack Beethoven's handwriting than it was the Enigma code. We even tried to have a German doctor read these. It did not go well. Today you can find all of Beethoven's known conversation books on the website of the Berlin State Library. Now, you might ask, why does this warrant scrutiny on Schindler? All he did was sell the books to a reputable institution. All the challenges afterwards can't be blamed on him. Well, in 1977, the euphoria of finally cracking the Beethoven code turned slightly sour when it came to light that Schindler had been a bit creative and had forged entries in these notebooks. His biography of Beethoven, one of the earliest on the subject, also contained some entries which employed the literary technique of embellishment. A huge sense of betrayal reverberated through academia, prompting many to view Schindler's actions as almost criminal, and many mistrusted everything written by Schindler unless it was backed up by other sources. One example of Schindler inserting an entry into one of the conversation books is as follows. He found 2 empty pages from February 1823 and added, If I am to blame that you wrote this overture, then I assume this guilt very gladly. But if the orchestra cannot play it and performs badly, that is not my fault. You show your loyal disciple Schindler too much honor if you lay the blame for such errors upon him. He later cited this passage in his biography of Beethoven as evidence that he was the inspiration of a piece called The Consecration of the House Overture, in a move we are calling peak cheek, although he did remove this in later editions. Looks like he found the limits to his cheek. One of his liberties is, however, quite telling and a lot more innocent. One day in 1824, Schindler took a roll from Beethoven's pantry. At this point, Beethoven's housekeeper demands that this is noted down in the book, most likely terrified of what would happen if they were accused of losing or overpaying for bread rolls. But after Beethoven's passing, he added in an entry saying that he offered to pay for the roll. In recent years, the perception of Schindler has somewhat softened, led by academics like Theodor Albrecht, who is currently in the process of translating the conversation books into English. We have to acknowledge that although Schindler might have taken some liberties, it's thanks to him that the books ended up in a library and not an incinerator. Beethoven's notebooks were not authored for posterity and were made up entirely of one-off scribbles by many different people. It took a lot of work to figure out who wrote what, and much of that work came from annotations in the notebooks by Schindler himself. And these annotations were often accurate. Schindler admittedly went beyond that to fill in blank spaces with things that may not have happened, but recent historians have mostly been able to tell these apart from the authentic entries. So this is why we're a bit skeptical when it comes to labeling macaroni and cheese as Beethoven's favorite. Being skeptical is good, but allow us to explain why we think this is a safe bet despite it coming from Schindler. First of all the things to exaggerate, the assertion that Beethoven likes macaroni and cheese seems fairly mundane, hardly peculiar enough to warrant fabrication. It's not like Schindler is claiming that he invented the dish. Secondly, we know from Beethoven's conversation books that he personally made a note to buy macaroni on multiple occasions, especially during 1823, when he seemed to be going through what one historian described as a macaroni phase. In light of this, making macaroni and cheese seems like a fairly safe bet. And we even have a recipe from 1817 which Beethoven was probably aware of, as it comes from the same book that contained the bread soup we made earlier in the video, das Wienerische bewährtes Kochbuch. It's not that far off from a modern baked pasta dish, using a milk base topped with seasoned Parmesan cheese and breadcrumbs, with the addition of some crayfish tails and bacon for protein. But we think we can make this even more attractive for Beethoven. We know that the man liked fish and that according to some of his handwritten notes, he preferred pike. In Jan Swafford's biography of Beethoven, he describes Beethoven's friends being worried about his health in August of 1823, and that he was eating too much of his favorite fish with eggs and macaroni. In addition, we know from Seyfried and Beethoven's shopping list that the maestro was a big fan of pike and whitefish in general. So we're going to make a slight variation of the macaroni contained in Das Wienerische bewährtes Kochbuch, biggest change being swapping crayfish tails with cod. Yes, pike would be better, but as far as we could find, pike is, where we live, not commercially available, so we're using cod, a widely available fish which was also commonly eaten in Beethoven's time. There is another small problem, and that's that macaroni, as we know it, wasn't really around yet. Don't worry, macaroni was already in existence, there were ample recipes for it, it was just a bit different. And we'll need to make it ourselves, using a method found in Libro de Arte Culinaria by Martino Valle di Blenio from around 1460, which is, arguably, the first mention of macaroni as a hollow tube pasta. First, take 200 grams of flour and add 2 eggs. Mix like you would any pasta dough until it comes together. Add a little bit of water until everything is nicely incorporated. These days macaroni is made with machines, and in the 19th century these were close to being invented, but they weren't ready yet, so we're doing this manually. Roll out some dough in a sheet and cut into strips about a pinky finger wide. The recipe tells us to roll it round a stick which isn't very helpful. We get a bit more reference 100 years later from Bartolomeo Scappi, who narrows this down to a stiletto, which is close to a metal chopstick, which is what we're using. Roll your dough nice and thin, then fold it over your stiletto. Once rolled over, fold shut and pull it out. The end result is not far off from modern macaroni. Let these dry, ideally in the sun, and they'll stay good for a couple of days. Now let's get back to our recipe from 1817. We're going to change the technique a bit, as some of the choices the book makes are, at least to us, rather odd. All ingredients which we are using would have been available in 1817 though, so we're not cheating. The book uses crayfish butter, which must have been very trendy in the 18th and 19th century German-speaking world. If you saw our Marie Antoinette video, you'll know that the brioche recipe there also recommended that the bread be eaten with this butter. For our April Fool's video this year, we made an approximation, which you can check out here or in the description. Using this butter will give you extra umami, but you can also just use normal butter. Next up, the protein. As mentioned, crayfish is being swapped with cod, and for the pork we're using smoked gammon. You can use bacon if you want. Then the book tells us to get Parmesan cheese. We'll gladly comply, but we're also adding in some Gruyere for creaminess. We're then instructed to take out a heap of breadcrumbs. Again, we'll do this, but also get out some flour. We'll explain why later. Lastly, the seasoning seems to be salt, pepper and mace. We're using all of those, but adding some nutmeg too. Why, you ask? Well, mace in German is Muskatblüte and nutmeg is Muskatnuss. We think that's cute. And they just pair well. We don't know why, we just feel an urge to add Muskatnuss when reading a recipe in German. Also not in the original recipe, but identified by Jan Swafford as a crucial ingredient in Beethoven's macaroni are 2 hard-boiled eggs, which we are going to mash with a fork. One last deviation. The recipe calls for creamy milk. These days, non-homogenized creamy milk is very hard to find, so we're using full milk and adding in some cream. It's a big mise-en-place, but the cooking is pretty quick and fun. Now for the method. We'll be varying quite a bit from the book here. In the book, milk and butter are made into a warm, thick mixture. Some additional butter is then melted in a heavy pot before a layer of boiled macaroni is placed on top. Then parmesan and breadcrumbs are sprinkled on top along with a bit of seasoning. After that, a layer of butter and milk sauce containing our fish and pork is poured over everything. We're instructed to repeat this until everything is used up. This sounds okay, but butter, milk and bread seasoned with salt, pepper, mace and or nutmeg, that's just a bechamel, so that's what we're going to do to impress Mr. Beethoven. First, take roughly 200 grams of our handmade macaroni and boil this in salt water. Make sure it's a bit undercooked, just below al dente. Don't worry, it will cook further later. While these cool down, cut up your pork and fish. The smaller the better. Melt the butter. Once melted, add in your flour. This is called making a roux. As soon as the roux starts getting a nutty smell and turns a teensy bit brownish, it's time to add in our creamy milk. Add the milk and keep stirring, ideally with a whisk, as we don't want any clumps. Once the roux has been absorbed by the milk and the milk is nice and warm, season with salt, pepper, mace and muskatnuss. Give it a taste test. It won't taste strong, but it should already be nice. Now add in all of your cheese, save about half of your parmesan. This will now become a very thick cheese sauce. Season some more and add in your eggs, fish and pork. Now take your bowl with macaroni and stir this glorious mixture through the pasta. Then decant in an oven tray and cover with the remaining parmesan and breadcrumbs. And put it in the oven set to high heat for about 15 to 20 minutes, depending on the size of your tray. When ready, it should look something like this. Now put on a plate and serve it to one of the greatest composers in history. While he enjoys, you can eat your half. Don't worry, he won't be throwing eggs. Is it good? Of course it is. It's mac and cheese, the 9th symphony of comfort food. We hope you enjoyed this performance. Thank you very much for watching.